Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I am Auron MacIntyre. There's been this back and forth about the woke right term and this stuff. I already did a few episodes on that. You guys are probably familiar with the conflict at this point. I don't want to rehash the drama on here because ultimately I think I've said my piece, and it's just be better if everybody kind of moved on and forgot about the guys who are throwing this term around. That said, there has been some interesting discussion centered here, not just on the term, which is vacuous and obviously a political weapon, but the people who are pushing it have revealed some of the goals that they have, some of the process behind what they're doing. One of the things that happened is that James Lindsay and Colin Wright here, who is one of the other kind of new atheist, radical centrist guys who's trying to push the term and force the term, is that both of them have identified nationalism as a problem. In fact, James Lindsay said that national conservatism is the final boss of the woke right. So, what are these guys doing attacking nationalism? Why is that so important to them? Well, Colin revealed in some of his discussions, I think some interesting thought process as to why they're going after nationalism in general. He was having a back and forth with my buddy Carl Benjamin, Sargon of Akkad, who's been on the show very many times. He runs the Lotus Eaters. And Carl was asking him a pretty reasonable question. Colin was saying, we have to get rid of tribalism. We have to get rid of the idea that people care more about the people they're related to or the people next to them or the people that they share a culture or tradition with. We have to destroy that idea. And Carl Benjamin says, okay, but like, how are we actually going to detribalize these communities? How are we going to get rid of the fact that people have a natural tendency to prefer other people like them? That sounds like it would be pretty involved. And Colin went into a kind of diatribe about how important it was that we get rid of this. We're never going to get rid of it entirely, but that we have this large social shaming campaign about the idea that you would have any loyalty or understanding that you are connected to people who share things in common. And I think that's interesting because Stalin, Joseph Stalin of the USSR, also had some interesting things to say about the need to get rid of tribalism and ultimately nationalism for the ascent of communism. Now, I'd like to be clear at the outset. I'm not calling Colin or James Lindsay communists. They're just liberals, which is an inevitable step on the road to communism, but is not itself definitively Marxist. That said, there's often an overlap in the goals of these two ideologies. And I don't think oftentimes the classical liberal, and I'm saying that ironically because neither Colin Wright nor James Lindsay are approaching classical liberals. If they spoke to any classical liberal in the 1700s, that person would probably throw them off the boat they were sitting on, right? Like these are not, John Locke said that an atheist should not be trusted, should not be allowed in public, should not have public influence, should not be allowed to hold a public office because they cannot be trusted, which would make guys like James Lindsay and Colin Wright immediately disqualified from hanging out with the father of classical liberalism. That said, people who have adopted that moniker often don't realize the level of social engineering they're actually advocating for. And so I wanted to take a look today. What did Stalin actually say about nations? He wrote an essay in, I believe it was 1913, called Marxism and the National Question. Now, obviously, we're against Marxism here, so we're going to be critical of it. But I think it would be interesting to compare and contrast with some of the demands being made by guys like James Lindsay and Colin Wright, because ultimately, while these guys might not have the same exact ideology, what they are interested in is scale. They want to be able to operate the empire at scale. And both the liberals and the communists recognize that to do that, they must get rid of local, tribal, and national identities. And so I'm going to dive into that essay today and see what Stalin had to say and why it bears a not so passing resemblance to some of the demands now being made by the ye old classical liberals. But before we get into that, guys, let's talk about today's sponsor. This episode of the Auron MacIntyre Show is proudly sponsored by Consumers Research. You've heard about Larry Fink and BlackRock and ESG and all the ways that they're ruining your life, making your groceries more expensive and making your video games more woke. Well, consumers research has spent the last 5 years making Larry's life hell, and they're just getting started. Their work and its consequences have been profiled by the Washington Post, New York Times, and most recently, Fox News business reporter Charlie Gasparino wrote a whole chapter in his book, Go Woke, Go Broke, on how effective they've been at dismantling BlackRock's ESG patronage scheme. He's making Larry Fink lose the last bit of hair on his balding head, and you should follow Will's work on X so you can laugh along with him. His handle is at Will Hild, at Will, WILLHILD, on X. All right. So, like I said, we're going to take a brief look at what Joseph Stalin had to say about the idea of nationalism, and kind of the issue that he is taking with it. Now, you have to understand that this was written prior to Stalin taking power. Again, I believe this essay was written in 1913. Now, it becomes rather significant because obviously Stalin will take control later on of the Soviet Union. And when he does, the way that the Soviet Union approaches nationality is very much altered, right? Beforehand, they had kind of recognized ethnic minorities, whether or not that there was a need for recognition of different national identities and whether there should be some kind of centralization around that as to how they organize the USSR. But that kind of went away with Stalin. Stalin had a different vision for how the USSR should approach the nationalist question. And like I said, what this reveals is something that's true about Marxism, but is also true about any ideology that is looking to universalize. Anyone who is looking to scale up civilization rather significantly. We've talked about this in different ways and from different angles a number of times. But when you are seeking to manage a large group of people, you have to break down the things that make them individualistic, the things that make them unable to cooperate with the system as it exists now. And so you have a scenario where if you want to centralize power, you have to get rid of things like tribal identities or national identities. Now, there might be some situations in which you want to break down some of the smaller identities. There might be some justification for it. Maybe we can make an argument. But ultimately, we need to understand that this is a critical part of the process. And that's why we see it in any society that is attempting to centralize power, is attempting to manage more and more people through its central bureaucratic process. Now, the interesting thing in this particular essay is that at this point, at least, Stalin does recognize that there is going to have to be some level of regional autonomy inside this collective communist empire, basically, right? This federation of communist republics. And so he recognizes that you can't just do everything from the capital the whole time. You will have to allow different areas to have some level of individual autonomy. However, he's worried about the way the autonomy will be characterized. He's worried that if people are allowed to continue to see themselves as nations and are allowed to understand themselves as organized by nations, they will not be as easy to control as we look into this. Obviously, we're not going to be reading this whole essay. It takes like 2 hours, I think, to get through out loud. So I'm just going to be picking a few quotes from it so we can get a general idea of where Stalin was going with this. But ultimately, I think it is helpful because it helps us to grasp kind of the mechanism that is being deployed in this scenario. So if we look early on, I'll just read the first few lines here. He says, the period of counter-revolution in Russia brought not only thunder and lightning in its train, but also disillusionment in the movement and lack of faith in common forces. As long as people believed in a bright future, they fought side by side, irrespective of nationality. Common questions first and foremost. But when doubt crept into the people's heart, they began to depart, each of them to their own national tent. Let every man count only upon himself, the national question first and foremost. So he's saying that there was an ideological unity, but as soon as that ideological unity broke, as long as there was no longer this kind of ideological future that you could focus on, people reverted back to national identity. Their first reflexive loyalty was to their nationality. And this is something that Stalin and communists don't like. They don't like that you're falling away from the class struggle, you're falling away from the ideological center, that instead you're reverting back to your classic loyalties as a person of a particular nation. And so he's saying, okay, how do we deal with these problems? At the same time, a profound upheaval was taking place in the economic life of the country. The year 1905 had not been in vain. One more blow had been struck at the survival of serfdom in the countryside. The series of good harvests, which succeeded the famine years, and the industrial boom which followed, furthered the progress of capitalism. Class differentiation in the countryside, the growth of towns, the development of trade and means of communication all took a big stride forward. This applied particularly to the border regions, and it could not but hasten the process of economic consolidation of nationalities of Russia. They were bound to be stirred into movement. So many people don't recognize this because they're not really familiar with more of what kind of Marx taught. But for Marx, capitalism was a critical step in the process towards communism. It wasn't just a competition between capitalism and communism. Marx understood capitalism as necessary because ultimately Marx wanted this economic consolidation and unification so that the communists could take over the structure and flip it towards their socialist ends. And so he's actually fine with capitalism up to the point where it breaks down what he thinks are the barriers to communism. And what are some of the barriers to communism that he's identifying here? Well, national identity, people living in the countryside instead of living in cities. These are behaviors that make it difficult for communists to take over. If you look at pretty much every communist movement, it tends to be pushed by the city centers. It tends to be pushed by alienated workers inside of factories, right? Not by farmers. Farmers tend to be more conservative. In fact, farmers have a nasty habit of being pro the king. If you look at something like the French Revolution, it's the Parisians that are the ones that are pushing the French Revolution. It's the farmers who are still loyal to the monarchy out in the sticks. They're the problem. And so Marx sees capitalism as this tool to break down these like particular feudal loyalties, these different national, regional identities, these tribal identities, and instead to forge a nation. Now, he's not against that forging. He just thinks then it needs to become communist. So the national project to him is a necessary step in the breakdown of things that will be barriers to communism, but they are not themselves where he wants to see everything end. The constitutional regime established at the time also acted in the same direction of awakening the nationalities. The spread of newspapers and literature generally, a general freedom of the press and cultural institutions, an increase the number of national theaters, and so forth, all unquestionably helped to strengthen national sentiment. The Duma, its elected campaign, if you don't know, that's like a kind of like a parliament for Russia. With its election campaign and political groups, have fresh opportunities for greater activity of the nation and provided a new and wide area of their mobilization. So again, he's looking at all of these different factors and saying, this is how you're going to get the destruction of these particular regional identities, and it's going to drive people towards this national identity. And he identifies nationalism as the same thing as capitalism. Like capitalism is part of the nationalistic process, or nationalism is part of a capitalistic project. And so these things kind of run together. And so he sees both of them as a necessary step. He's not against the fact that they break down the identities he also wants to break down. However, he sees them as a transitional thing, not a goal, not a place you want to get stuck. Obviously, that's why he ends up being very hostile to both capitalism and nationalism at the end. We're going to talk a little more about why, like what he thought about this process, why he opposed it, and why ultimately he was so emphatic about breaking down national identity. But before we do, guys, let's talk about Blaze TV. Hey guys, if you've been watching this show for a while, then you know that around here we encourage something that conservatives usually don't do, winning. That's why it was so great to see Donald Trump's electoral victory, along with the cultural and political momentum that the right just hasn't had in a very long time. But we also know that the fight is far from over, and at some point, the left will start pushing for censorship again. If you like what I'm doing here and you want to keep it going, then head over to Blaze TV. They have the behind the scenes content, exclusives, and documentaries that you're just not going to see anywhere else. And it starts at just $8 a month, basically the price of a fancy coffee, when you use the promo code Auron at checkout. That's only 26 cents a day to stand with a platform that stands with you. So go to blazetv.com/Auron and subscribe today. That's blazetv.com/Auron. The promo code is AURON, and you'll save $20 right now off the annual plan. All right. So again, he goes into all these different possible nationalistic movements from Zionism, the Poles, the Tartars, Armenians, Georgians, all these different peoples that might have possible nationalistic ambitions. And he says the wave of nationalism swept onwards with increasing force, threatening to engulf the mass of the workers. And the more the movement for emancipation declined, the more plentiful nationalism pushed forth its bosom. So we have this class consciousness, but this nationalism keeps getting in the way of it. It's a boundary to this class consciousness. People keep reverting back to these stupid national identities instead of forging themselves into these worker collectives across this international coalition. At this time, at this difficult time, social democracy had a high mission to resist nationalism and to protect the masses from the general epidemic. For social democracy and social democracy alone could do this by countering nationalism with a tried weapon of internationalism, with the unity and indivisibility of class struggle. So he sees nationalism as this very serious barrier, an epidemic, he calls it, for the masses accepting social democracy and ultimately communism. And so there has to be a way to fight back against the nationalism that is being pushed. And he says, obviously, we need an international solution, right? The key is to keep things international, not national. And how do we create international unity? How do we move beyond the national identity? Class struggle, right? That's how we're going to actually bind these people together. The more powerful the wave of nationalism is, and the louder had to be the call of social democracy for fraternity, unity among the proletariats of the nationalities of Russia. And this connection, and in this connection, particular firmness was demanded of the social democrats of the border regions who came into direct contact with the nationalist movements. So again, here we see that it is evident that a serious and comprehensive discussion of the national question be required. Consistent social democrats must work solidly and indefatigably against the fog of nationalism, no matter what quarter it proceeds, no matter from what quarter it proceeds. So again, nationalism is the enemy. Nationalism, as some might say, is the final boss of what the communists are trying to do. They must destroy nationalism. They must destroy regional identities, tribal identities. These things must be ended if communism is to prevail. Now, like I said, this is a long essay. You can go through and read it. It has some interesting observations, but of course, overall, it is communist in nature, and so therefore, it is not the best. It is not giving you good information in a lot of these areas, or good theory or understanding. However, it is interesting as Stalin attempts to define the nation in this first section here. He talks about kind of what a nation might be, and he doesn't like the kind of ethnographic category. He doesn't like the idea that a nation is a people entirely disembodied. He actually says you basically do have to share a landmass together. So, for instance, he routinely rejects Jews as a unified nation because he says, look, there's Jews in Russia, there's Jews in America, there's Jews in all these Caucasus countries in the Middle East. They don't even speak the same language, much less share geographic region. So how can they be one nation, one people? So he rejects that because they don't share a similar background, or at least they don't share a common language. Language is a big deal for Stalin, but he says it's more than just the language. He says you also need to share a physical space. So the physical space is not an option. Like you have to have a historic interaction over many generations in order to create this identity of a nation. He also says, not surprisingly, as a communist, that you need a shared economic zone. Like you need a shared economic interest. If you don't have one shared economic identity or interaction, then you are just not going to forge the bonds that create community. And then finally, and interestingly, for a materialist like Stalin, he ends up talking about the national character. He says it's the psychological disposition or the national spirit. He comes up with kind of like all of these euphemisms to try to avoid identifying that there is something of a national spirit to people, right? A zeitgeist, if you would. But there's a shared cultural Dasein. Again, he would not use that language, but he's recognizing the phenomenon. He kind of settles on culture. It gets reflected in culture, and culture shows this like shared psychology, the shared understanding that people have. But it's surprisingly abstract language for a materialist. He's kind of recognized, even though those are kind of his core beliefs, he can't move beyond the fact that there seems to be this emergent, shared understanding that a people have, that a nation has, that gives it particularities. And one of the things he attacks over and over again, one of the things that he really does not like, is particularities. That communism needs to destroy the particularities that different tribes and nations have, because those are barriers to the consolidation of communist power. And so, for Stalin, the existence of nations and the existence of subgroups like tribes within nations is a barrier to the application of communist identity. And so, it has some pretty serious limitations on the way that you can operate the country if it allows to stay in place. And so this is why I wanted to point to kind of Colin Wright's assertion that we need to have this like intense detribalization, and him maybe not understanding the level of social engineering that he's demanding, or if he does understand the level of social engineering he's demanding, why he thinks that's okay. When you're talking about the top-down elimination of people's natural instincts, you need to be doing that for a pretty good reason, right? Like we recognize that people steal, that people do all kinds of things that naturally that aren't great. They kill, they steal, they cheat, they do all these kind of things that we don't like. And so it's not like there aren't laws to correct those behaviors. But at the same time, we recognize that there are limitations to human nature and what you can change, and that you have to be careful about destroying natural systems lest you find out that they were undergirding some critical aspect of society, that they actually create a support system that you didn't understand. And the communists are famous for doing this, right? They destroy everything from religion to the nation to the tribe, all the way down to the family. They want parents and children to be more loyal to the party than they are to each other. They want to make sure that you are so unparticular, that you are so universally loyal to your class and its struggle rather than to any natural, biological, or spiritual tie that you might have to family or tribe or nation, that they are willing to destroy everything all the way down to the family. And so there's a large propaganda campaign, a massive top down manipulation of social engineering in an attempt to break those bonds, get rid of those national, tribal, and even familial loyalties and particularities. Because when you have a preference for your own nation or your own tribe or your own family, then you aren't going to follow all the communistic dictates. You're not going to go for all this equity. You're not going to go for this completely uniform distribution that never occurs anyway, because communism is a lie. But you need to break down those loyalties, because if you don't, you can't operate the system at scale. You can't force the artificial ideology that you want down onto people. And so it's critical that you break down every one of the loyalties all the way from the family up to the tribe, up to the nation, right? Now, tribe is a difficult thing at the moment, right? We have a difficult conception of this, because at the same time in the United States, we're attempting to keep the national identity, right? And we also want to keep the family identity. But we have a problem with the intermediate identities, right? And a lot of people in America, including apparently guys like James and Colin, have a problem with national identities as well. Nationalism is a problem. However, the in the United States, at least on the right, on the actual right, actual people who are trying to conserve the country in some meaningful sense, we recognize that nationalism is actually good. We want to be America first. We want to serve the people of this nation. We don't want any kind of international identity. We don't want some kind of unified governance at a global level. We reject globalism. We do care enough about our nation to create a level of particularity that exists at the national level. At the same time, we also want a level of particularity that exists at the familial level, because what we've recognized is that this destruction of identity and this destruction of community is also leading to destruction of families. Families are breaking apart, they're breaking down. People are getting divorced, they're destroying families. People aren't marrying in the first place. They're treating their families as something that's transient. People are, you're like, oh, I'll go build my own family. I don't need to be loyal to my blood family. That's not as important. Those kind of things. When you create surrogacy and this kind of stuff, where your people are literally purchasing children from others, like you're breaking down the basic of what makes a family strong and necessary. And so a lot of people are recognizing that the loss of identity at the familial level is a huge problem. The thing that we're having trouble with is this intermediate level of identity, right? How do you deal with the fact that you, at least on the right, people who I think are ultimately correct about human nature, want to preserve a national identity, and you want a familial identity that's robust, but you also have this middle layer that you could call tribe or community, right? Those are different, but not so different. Tribe tends to be people who are related together, and extended community is really just the tribes that have interrelated, right? They're people who have intermarried. It's different tribes that have worked together and they've forged an identity that is not entirely tribal. It's no longer completely trapped in that kind of original ground of ethnos, but is not itself be moved beyond to like a more national identity, right? This is what Stalin would have said is almost a feudal understanding, right? And so in the United States, we're having a little bit of trouble with that, because if you look at, say, de Tocqueville, right? You look at Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America. He recognizes that America entering in to these voluntary associations, these intermediate institutions, somewhere between the family and the wider nation, is really the key to America's continued existence. He says this is what's going to make America America. Actually, funny enough, a lot of people who bring up de Tocqueville in this reference don't bring up the fact that in that chapter he says that America's individualism is itself a little bit of a problem, and that what will solve this problem, what will create this layer of identity somewhere between the family and the nation, are these associations, these voluntary associations. But the key is that those associations are voluntary, and they tend to be drawn into some kind of tribalistic line. You have these voluntary associations of churches or voluntary associations of civic clubs, and they tend to people coming from a background of a particular religious community or a particular a geographical area, people with the shared heritage. They tend to have some kind of binding artifact like this. Now, many of them move and adopt multiples of this, right? There's multiple tribes allowed into this religious association. There's multiple groups that are allowed into this civic organization, but it is certainly not a nationalistic identity, right? This is the kind of the in-between step as your identity scales up. And these are natural and positive and organic creations. They do a good job of standing between the national identity's desire to dissolve the region, but also allow for something to move beyond just the most basic familial and basic tribal identity. Now, the question we want to ask ourselves, and I think a question that's probably difficult and thorny, but needs to be addressed, is kind of what you want, what level of organization you want to be available in your country. Because as we're going to see here, the last part of this essay is, the national question in Russia. And he asks, what are we going to do about this? Right? Like he goes through this whole essay. And again, forgive me for not reading the whole thing. It's very long. Oh, not very long, but it's too long for to read through the whole stream. But he talks about what is a nation and how is it constituted, and there's a lot of background there that's interesting, but thoroughly academic and nerdy. And I don't want you to to glaze your eyes to glaze over as I read through all the ethnic dynamics of Russia in the 1900s. That said, we in the United States need to start thinking about like what we're comfortable with when it comes to identity and how we want to organize. Because we need to recognize that originally the United States itself was something of a collection of nations, right? We call them states, and these 13 states were 13 individual places where people had cultural particularities, where oftentimes entire tribes, key families, aristocratic families would have large swaths of power. They have definitive cultures. And for a very long time in the American system, we had a federal system that allowed these different peoples and these different states to operate under one unified federal government, but still have a large degree of autonomy to where they could express their individual understanding. Many of these places had state churches. Maryland was originally Catholic, right? They had definitive communities with particularities that the region had to deal with, and they were still able to participate in the wider United States for the most part, but they were allowed to keep that level of familial, tribal, communal, and then state autonomy before kicking it up to the federal government. That's how we understood this question in America. For Stalin, this is terrible. He hates this idea, right? He says, because he recognizes that you can't centralize everything, but he says that having a national autonomy is just like a backwards program of nationalism. That like if you allow people to be, even if they're under the communist government as a general rule, if you allow them to maintain national loyalty and national identity in the classical sense, then they will always ultimately defer to that loyalty before they defer to their communist loyalty. And so this will serve as a barrier to communism. And so he says this is a very bad thing that we need to go ahead and get rid of, right? And so this is a very similar sentiment to the one we're seeing from some of our disgruntled liberal friends, right? Like we need to destroy the loyalty, all intermediate loyalties. Like you may be allowed to keep the family. Like they seem to be kind of okay with that. They recognize that they can't go directly after the family. But anything else, up to and including loyalty to the nation, is the final boss, as they've said. And so, why do they need to destroy it? Why do they share this goal with the communists? Because again, I don't think that they're communists, but I think that there's a lesson we need to understand about power and its consolidation and what is necessary and what level of social engineering is being demanded by people who are ultimately pushing that understanding of human nature. So, like I said, in the United States, we had a little bit of a solution to this problem, mainly because of the federalism and the level of regional autonomy that we were allowing. We weren't enforcing an ideological belief on every single person in every single nation, and in this case, every single state. And so we didn't need a large program of social engineering to force everyone to follow this. We didn't need to centralize power to the level that the communists obviously were planning to do. We didn't need to enforce ideological control onto every region. We didn't need to destroy tribal or communal or state loyalties. In fact, state loyalties continued to be a big deal up until the Civil War, where guys like Robert E. Lee, who were obviously, he was offered the command of the Union Army. He was somebody who's the greatest general available at that time, but his loyalty was to his state, to his people, to his tribe, before it was to the nation. And this is where I think you see some differentiation, right? Because for many people, especially modern liberals, that's a very bad thing. The fact that Robert E. Lee was more loyal to a subsidiary level of identity below the unified universal nation, that itself is a problem. And that's just nationalism, right? That's just on the nationalistic level. But the Civil War, make no mistake, is ultimately the final war for American nationalism. And once it's resolved, the kind of inevitable move of America was going to be towards the victory of this unified kind of imperial nationalism over the regional federalism that had been a huge part of the American identity previously. And so, what we have to look at now in the United States is what level of subsidiary identities are we um, comfortable with? What's optimal? Because I want to be clear, there are downsides to hardcore tribalism. Like there are very big downsides to intense tribalism. If you've ever watched Lawrence of Arabia, that movie is about many things, but one of the things it's about is the fact that the Arab tribes simply cannot work together, right? They don't have this idea of kind of the larger institutions that sit between the tribe and kind of the caliphate. In a lot of Islamic political structure, like you either have the large Islamic empire and then you have tribes, and the idea of like the nation state in between doesn't really stick, which is why it was so easy for like Britain and these other countries to kind of carve up the Middle East when they took control of these mandates, is because ultimately there wasn't really a lot of national identity as in our modern understanding among many of the Middle Eastern peoples. And so you have this scenario where you have these mess of states that are drawn up by the British, and in some sense, is it because they don't understand the culture of Arabs at the time? Sure, yes, but also it's because kind of the Middle East itself, that Islamic culture just did not have identity that was available to them that created organization at that level. And so if you watch Lawrence of Arabia and kind of the story about the British and you know the war between them and the tribes of the Middle East at the time, one of the problems that T. Lawrence rather runs into on a regular basis is that he can't get the tribes to work together. That ultimately they might unify for like one of these like strikes against the British, right? But ultimately they can't organize in a way that would allow them to stay together and stay as a significant political force to strike back against this unified British Empire. And so, because the Muslim tribes have such a serious problem with coordination, they're too tribal. They're so tribal that they can't cooperate. They end up failing, right? And if you've ever listened, there's a guy Ed Dutton. I've been on his channel, and I'm pretty sure I've had him on this channel as well. But Ed Dutton has this theory that one of the evolutionary advantages of Christianity was the fact that it allowed for higher levels of cooperation between peoples. And so you could have these wider European empires that operated because it allowed for like different levels of identity. People could have a familial identity, they could have a tribal identity, they could have a kind of like a state identity, and then they could have like a wider identity of Christendom. And those things didn't have to be in conflict. There was a level of cooperation that was allowed across these barriers that normally were pretty big deals for human organization, and that's what allowed a large amount of European countries to kind of win the race, as it were. Not that they didn't worry against each other; they often did, but not to the degree. They were able to cooperate, coordinate, trade, create alliances to a higher degree because of that level of cooperation. So there is a level of tribalism that we want to avoid because it makes it impossible for us to function at certain levels of organization, and it makes it hard for us to compete with others that are able to cooperate, right? So there's a downside to over tribalization. That said, there is also clearly now we're discovering the other end of this problem, right? Because it's not just a one-sided problem. There is too much tribalization, right? But there also seems to be, at some level, not enough. You can reach a point where if you have completely lost your particularity, you've completely lost your identity, you've completely lost your ability to prefer your nation and its people and their well-being to others, then all of a sudden you become one of these universalist leftists, right? You can't say no to mass immigration. You don't know how to say, actually, we should care about the well-being of America before we care about the well-being of Ukraine or Israel or Zimbabwe or any other nation. You don't have the ability to isolate the well-being of your people and say, this is going to be a priority. And so there's a balance somewhere, right? We recognize that there are two sides of this that can be not ideal, right? We can have over tribalization where it makes any kind of cooperation impossible, and it reduces the scale of civilization to the point where you are unable to compete with those who are operating at a higher scale of civilization. However, if you go to the open-ended model, the open society model, where we're all going to be a global government and we're going to have the Star Trek future, and we're going to have this gay race communism that's international and doesn't care about your identities in any serious or traditional way. That creates this open-ended suicidal culture, which is why James Burnham said liberalism is ultimately the ideology of Western suicide, because it erodes the ability of a people to prefer itself to others. And that's ultimately what, unfortunately, I think many of the disgruntled liberals don't understand about their own ideology. They aren't communists. They don't agree with the communists on certain points. In fact, in some cases, they can make entire careers about preaching against the dangers of communism. However, their ideology is a stepping stone. It is a stop on that ride. Now, we can have a debate as to whether or not liberalism inevitably leads to communism. I think that's its own discussion. But the point is, they share these features, right? They need to break down these identities at some level. And so, unfortunately, whether they recognize it or not, the nationalist is the natural enemy of the liberal, and the liberal is the enemy of the nationalist, because they recognize nationalism as a danger to their project of deracination of people, to breaking down those barriers that allow for higher levels of organization. And as the United States became more ideological, and as the United States needed to compete with other states that are organized at a high level of complexity, at a ideological level of uniformity, we created more and more organizations and institutions and legal apparatuses to control the ideology of the American people, to wear away their particularities, their willingness to operate in tribes or communities, or even states. Right? We needed to destroy state rights because you even turn this around. Talk to a liberal and talk to them about the state rights, and often they'll say like, "Oh, a state's right to do what?" Right? Because they're implying slavery or Jim Crow, because you're not allowed to have that regional autonomy to make decisions. You have to be forced by the state to go in and change the way that you behave. Now, maybe you think that's good. Maybe you think that's bad. I certainly don't like slavery, but ultimately, that is still a unification of identity, a unification of ideology or rather, identity under ideology by the state. And the way it does that is to destroy the particularity, to destroy the regional understanding and its autonomy, because they recognize the danger that this holds. And that's ultimately what Stalin says here at the end of the national question. He says, hey, the national autonomy does not solve this problem. We want regional autonomy instead. He says that right here. We want the only correct solution is regional autonomy for such crucialized units as Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, the Caucasus, etc. He wants to get rid of the classical understanding of national identity, and he says he wants these regions to be governed as like basically economic zones, right? They don't have particular identities. And later on, remember, Stalin would support like the deportation of ethnic minorities to avoid type of conflicts he was worried about. He would talk about the need to Russify everybody and make sure that they destroyed any of their regional identity and instead had some kind of rare shared Russian identity in many cases. He supported some pretty harsh treatment of people in order to advance this project, ultimately of kind of this. We need to get rid of these regions as being any kind of classic national identity, tribal identity, anything like that, any kind of ethnic identity. And instead, we just kind of want zones or regions that we operate, right? And he says the only cure for this is the organization on the basis of internationalism, right? This is the key. To unite locally the workers of all nationalities of Russians into a single integrative collective body, to unite these collective bodies into a single party. This is the task, right? This is what he sees. And he says there is no middle course. We must, these principles must triumph. We cannot compromise. We cannot allow the continuation of these particular national identities. They need to be dissolved so that we can have this unified ideological identity across all of the different sections of this vast Soviet empire. And so the thing you need to recognize, kind of the point of this at the end, is whether it be liberals against nationalism or communists against nationalism, they may not have the exact same end goals, but they need the same process. Because if you want to operate government systems at scale, you must get rid of particularity. Particularity is your enemy when you want to operate large systems. And so, federalism, states' rights, separate identities for separate groups inside of the United States, these are all things that must be annihilated. They must be annihilated if you were to have one rule across all of them, right? You can't have a state operating as if, Florida has a significantly different identity than California or New York. Florida needs to conform to California and New York, which therefore dictates the entire nation's identity. That is what needs to happen. And when you have that outlook, when you are basically you are ideologically opposed to federalism, then you are ideologically opposed to, I think, ultimately the spirit of the United States. Because the spirit of the United States is not the elimination of peoples. It's not the elimination of identities. It's not the cleansing. It's not the ethnic cleansing of Americans until you generate this one homogenous bunch that you get to use, through the Civil Rights Act or whatever, that you get to dictate ideology to. It's the idea that people can live and work in this federated system and still find common ground and identity as Americans while caring for their communities, their families, right? That's what matters. Stalin specifically talks about the need in this essay to destroy national institutions that create those intermediate institutions between the family and the ideological state. And if we're fair, that has also been the project of America for the last 50 at least years, right? Is destroying the fraternal organizations, the churches, the community organizations, the groups that once were the backbone, the ones that Alexis de Tocqueville recognized as the most critical part of the American identity. We have been decided to break those down and say, no, every institution must be open to everyone. Every institution must be universal. Every institution must align with the ideology of the state. And so in that, we have followed Joseph Stalin's national question prescriptions. And this is the kind of stuff that unfortunately one of the disgruntled liberals want to continue because they see identity as something to be destroyed. I think instead we need to recognize that that understanding is what created the opening for wokeness in the first place. The type of identity politics, the gross, coarse, completely racial politics that were created by wokeness are themselves bad. I think that's pretty easy for everyone to recognize. But the answer is not the entire elimination of identity. The answer is a cultivation of healthy identity. Because the only thing that's going to push back against this ideological creation of artificial identity is real, healthy, organic human understandings of well-being. And that comes from our friends, our families, our communities. Some people might even call it a tribe from time to time. But these things all build on each other. And as Jonathan Peugeot was saying on Twitter, and I think this is a really good insight, the key to bad identity is not the elimination of identity. The key to beating bad identity is creating a properly ordered subsidiarity of identities. I am an American. Yes. I am also a Floridian. I belong to a specific family and a specific religion, a specific sect of Protestantism. I belong to an extended family that moves well beyond my immediate nuclear family, and I have loyalties to them and priorities to them. But I also recognize that larger tribe is integrated into community, one in which I also hold loyalties to, and I have duties to. If we can create these natural layers of identity, not only do they make us happier people, but they also insulate us from ideological corruption, the kind that I think both Marxists and, frankly, the current crop of liberals are trying to push down on people. So I just wanted to explore that, guys. I thought it was an interesting contrast between kind of what Stalin wrote about here, what is being pushed in the American mainstream as an answer, and what I think is ultimately the better answer to both. That we need to be looking at these things as identity as something that is layered, multifaceted, not something that is to be heightened to the point of hyper-tribalism and making it impossible to cooperate, but also cannot be eliminated in some kind of top-down social engineering project. And I think that while I'm not trying to be the carefully nuanced fence-sitter bro, I do genuinely think that that is the way to proceed forward. I think that is a understanding that fits in a Christian framework, an understanding that fits in a framework of American tradition with the federal system and the recognition of regional autonomy that we have here. And I think ultimately this is probably the way that we should address this, rejecting both the communist project and definitions, but also the modern liberal ones as well, as I think both of them are ones that ultimately, as James Burnham points out, brings us to Western suicide. All right, guys, we got a few questions over here from the people, so I'll bring that up real quick. Alex says, Auron, when will you convert to Catholicism? Again, I've been asked this many times, and my answer is always the same. I am Southern Baptist for the most Catholic reason imaginable, because my father is Southern Baptist, and his father before him, and his father before him. These are my people. This is my community. And so this is where my loyalty lies. That said, I wish only the best to my favorite Catholic brothers and sisters. I hope the new pope's a good pope. I'm glad that I don't have to worry too much about what he thinks. Let's see here. Alexandra says similar questions always appear in context of dictators. So do you think Lindsay, Wright, etc. believe everything they say about race and culture, or are these just words in pursuit of influence? I think Colin Wright probably believes most of what he says. James is, I think, a little more cagey in his propaganda and his navigation of that. I think he's even inadvertently admitted to that several times online and in tweets that people share. That said, again, I don't want to make this episode about them. This was more about the issue. Again, the idea of nationalism, whether it should be your ultimate enemy. If you're pursuing nationalism as your ultimate enemy, what are you doing? The fact that guys like Lindsay and Wright seem to think that pursuing nationalism will lead to dictatorships is a little bit telling on themselves, but Perspicacious Heretic says, I assume elites will use some level of social engineering. Sometimes is this sometimes a necessity? And if so, what forms and how much is acceptable? It seems to me that they need to be a gentle guiding force. Yeah. So this is tricky, right? When is it social engineering and when is it just having a positive influence on the culture? And if we're operating at scale, aren't we going to have some level of uniformity that's going to feel like social engineering? And the answer is yes, all of these things are true. So previously, states just didn't have ideological apparatuses that allowed them to do what we do today. They didn't have mass communication. They didn't have Hollywood. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have the things that allowed you to push propaganda on a regular basis. So you could have ideological conformity, but it had to be at like really small scales, right? Everybody went to the same temple. Everybody went to the same cathedral. That allowed a certain level of cultural uniformity. Now, you could say that's social engineering, but I think that's a more organic and scaled down understanding of actually just cultural creation. When it becomes social engineering, I think is when you attempt to do very inhuman things to people at a mass scale. Now, is that necessary at the scale that we now operate society? Unfortunately, I think it is. And so does it mean we're always going to be engaging at it on some level? Yes, unfortunately, that's going to be true. I think part of this is rethinking how we understand operation at scale. Can we return to a version of federalism that allows our country to operate and compete, but does not mean that the central government constantly gets to dictate ideologically what people will believe and how they'll live their lives? I'm hopeful that we are heading that direction. I think actually the benefits of scale are breaking down, and so therefore the benefits of mass social engineering are starting to break down. That said, there is always going to be some interaction with the elites, and they are always going to shape culture to some degree. And so if you would like to call that social engineering, then yes, you're correct that will always exist at some level. But I think the level we have it at right now is very unhelpful. And as you point out, gentle guiding force is definitely the way to go. Tiny Stupid Demon says, I'm confident that under the correct circumstances, James and Colin will quickly pivot to classical liberalism in one country. Oh, okay. So I guess like nationalism. So renaming nationalism. I see what you're saying there. Okay. I hope so. I hope so. Ultimately, I think that would be good. I think that their current need to attack organic identities, especially national identities, is really bad. I think that that's not a good way to organize the conservative movement or the right. And so I hope ultimately they recognize this. James Coffey says Lindsay's false premise. One, Auron Tucker believed that there is no truth, just power. Isn't God's ultimate power /truth? Candace slash Tucker believe if topic is taboo, it equals truth. Auron's comments re free speech. I'm trying to grasp some of that. I mean, the first one is certainly true. He acts as if guys he's named, like myself and Tucker, are just like horribly, say there's no truth, only power. I've explained, obviously, that's not the case. I just said here, obviously, that there's quite a bit of unescapable truth about human nature. So obviously, that's false. I can't really speak to whether Candace or Tucker believe that every topic which is taboo is true. I don't think that's true of Tucker. I can't say that I watch a ton of Candace Owens, so I just don't know. I do know she embraces some stuff like the moon landing's fake, or and stuff like that, which I just don't agree with. But the third one with Auron's comments re free speech, I'm not exactly sure what that one means. Unfortunately, sorry about that. Matt Grittier says, "Great show as always." Well, thank you very much, Matt. Definitely appreciate it. Appreciate you guys making the show possible today. Alex says, Auron, isn't the rebellion against the church the downfall of the West? Well, I don't know. How's Europe doing? I guess. Right. I don't think that the Protestant America is ultimately a rebellion against the church, because I believe Protestant America is part of the church. If you just mean against Catholicism, again, I would point out that the most Catholic countries in the world aren't necessarily always doing the best right now. But that said, I wish once again the best for my Christians and brothers and sisters, whether they be Catholic or Protestant. Uh, Alex again says, thanks as always for the great educational content. Absolutely, man. Appreciate it. And he says, let's make the Dave Green versus James Lindsay debate happen. I would, of course, love to see that. Dave has a level of patience that is perhaps superhuman, perhaps too much, too patient for Dave Green. That said, he's a fantastic guy, very thoughtful, has pretty much roundly destroyed every single person from that camp he has been in a conversation with, not because he's hostile or just brings a great rhetorical force, but simply because he's right and thoughtful. I'm sure he would be just as effective in a discussion with James Lindsay as with the other interlocutors he's had. All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. Once again, thank you everybody for watching. It's been great talking to you. If you would like to, or if it's your first time on the YouTube channel, you need to go ahead and subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show. You need to click the bell notifications, all that, so you know when we go live. If you'd like to get this show as a podcast, you need to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. And if you'd like to support the show, don't forget you can head over to shopblazemedia.com, click on the Auron MacIntyre collection, and you can pick up some merch there to show everybody that you support the show. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And as always, I will talk to you next time.